to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men. For biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift a load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why I think, that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that. Yeah, well, you know, partly what you're trying to do in the future authoring process is say, okay, well, what's your highest value? Right? It's the star. It's like, okay, what are you aiming for? You can decide, man. But, you know, there's some criteria. It should be good for you. It should be good for you in a way that facilitates your moving forward. Maybe it should be good for you in a way that's also good for the family and the community. It should cover the domain of life. I mean, there's constraints on what you should regard as a value. But within those constraints, you have the choice. You have choice. Well, the thing is that people will carry a heavy load if they get to pick the goddamn load. So, and they think, well, I won't carry any load. It's like, okay, fine, but then you're like the sled dog that doesn't have a sled to pull. You're gonna tear pieces out of your own legs because you're bored. You know, people are pack animals. They need to pull against a weight. And that's not true for everyone. It's not true particularly, say, for low conscientious people. I mean, maybe they're open and creative or extroverted and some other things. But for the typical person, they'll eat themselves up unless they have a load. This is why there's such an opiate epidemic among dispossessed, white, middle-aged guys who are unemployed in the US. It's like they lose their job, they're done, right? They despise themselves. They develop chronic pain syndromes and depression. And the chronic pain is treated with opiates. It's like, that's what we're doing. So, yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Is you have to, and it's so interesting to watch the young men when you talk to them about responsibility. They're so goddamn thrilled about it. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights, 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 rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. That's where the meaning in life is. So.
How do psychologists define creativity?
Well, I think the most fundamental element of creativity is actually conceptualized as a biological trait. So people have different personalities, and we all know that, although our terminology for describing those personalities is broad and somewhat difficult to categorize. But psychologists have made a lot of progress on that over the last
particularly in the last 40 years, really from a strictly scientific perspective. And we know that people differ in extroversion, and extroverted people are gregarious and enthusiastic and assertive. And so they seem to wend their way through the world by utilizing social capital and social networks. Extroverts don't necessarily like you, but they like to be around you.
And are creative people
Extroverts?
No, creative people are slightly tilted towards extroversion, but that's not the fundamental dimension.
Okay.
Introverted people like to spend time alone, and there's plenty of creative introverted people. That another personality dimension is known as neuroticism, somewhat unflatteringly, and it's an index of sensitivity to negative emotion, so that if you know people who are volatile, they're touchy and they tend to fly off the handle, or they're sad or morose or anxious or tend to avoid stressful situations, then they tend to be higher in trait neuroticism. And that's specifically a negative emotion dimension. Extroversion is an index of positive emotion. And so they're separate biological systems, positive and negative emotion.
So I'm trying to get us back to creativity.
Yep. Well, the third category is agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate, and they basically live for close, intimate, personal relationships. There's conscientious people who are dutiful, and then there are open people. And the open people, the dimension is called openness to experience. They're people who are fundamentally interested in ideas. So if you're talking to an open person, they will immediately move the conversation to the discussion of ideas. So most of the people in the audience tonight, for those who aren't here for political curiosity, are here because they're open people. They want to hear an intellectual discussion, and so open people are interested in ideas. That's the intellect component of openness. And then they're also interested in aesthetics, and that would be where the artists really, intellect and aesthetics is where the artists come out. And the thing that's important to know about that, and it's why I went through all 5 traits, is that these are attributes and ways of looking at the world, ways of behaving that are fundamentally rooted in biology. They're very, very deep. It's not a surface trait by any stretch of the imagination. And creative people also tend to be higher in trait intelligence, technically speaking. And that's the ability to manipulate abstractions rapidly.
So is creativity a sort of second level then? Because the traits that you've just described don't include them. Where are they in that group?
Well, creativity loads very highly with openness. Creativity and openness are probably synonymous, more or less. Although it isn't obvious that interest in ideas per se is the same as creativity, but there's very few people who are artistic who aren't very interested in ideas. So they move along the same path very tightly.
So let's unpack this notion, because it's axiomatic that creativity and art are indistinguishable. Is that true from the point of view of a psychologist?
I would say it's a pretty decent truth. It's open people are the ones that are interested in aesthetics. So there are lots of people who are, in some sense, blind to beauty. It's actually one of the things that distinguishes, strangely enough, it distinguishes conservatives and liberals, roughly speaking, because liberal people tend to be high in openness. They tend to be creative, but they're low in trait conscientiousness, so they're not very dutiful. They're not particularly orderly. They're not particularly industrious, not compared to conservatives.
Liberals?
Yes. Well, it's partly because, you see, this is one of the paradoxes. Conservatives are high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they're low in openness. And I think the reason for that, in part, is that it's not that easy to be creative if you're too industrious or orderly. Because imagine you want to be a musician and you're 18, 19 years old, or worse, 25 years old, Well, the thing is that it's an insane thing to do if you're someone who's dutiful and career-oriented and practical, because the probability that you're going to monetize your creativity is so low that it's futile to even attempt it in many situations. And so if you're too concerned with convention and productivity, then that's going to undercut your ability to manifest adherence to your creative vision, which also takes you in all sorts of directions, none of which are necessarily practical. So one of the ways of thinking about creativity is that it's a gambling strategy, and conservatives make low risk, low return, but certain bets, really. And whereas the more liberal types and the more creative types, they make high risk, high return bets. And so almost all of them fail. But those who succeed dramatically, and they also change the world. And so, although it's very foolish to be creative, it's creative people who
lead the vanguard forward into the unknown and transform the world. So foolish as it is, it's absolutely necessary.
Foolish because risky?
Yes, because risky, yes. I mean, it's foolish in the same way that a high risk, high return bet is foolish. There's a high probability that you'll lose. And so if you're a conservative person, you're very concerned about hedging your bets. You don't want to lose. Being creative is a very bad game to play, but you won't play it anyways because you're conservative, so it isn't going to matter.
So you are an open late teen, and you have conservative parents, and you say, Mom, Dad, I think I've decided that I'm going to be an artist.
Oh yeah, and they think, what's wrong with that kid?
That's a complicated conversation, isn't it?
Yes, yes. It's like discussing color with someone who's colorblind. And I mean that. And it's actually a perverse thing about conservatives in some sense, because the data on the economic utility of artists is really, really strong. I mean, artists and entrepreneurs are the same people. And of course, entrepreneurs are the people who provide all of the vision for the entire capitalist system. They're absolutely necessary. But conservatives tend to be so blind to art that they can't even see that the artists are the people who drive the economy forward.
But you make them sound so bad.
No, look, I mean, so here's another way of thinking about it. Is liberals,
are we talking about political conservatives and political liberals?
Yes, we're also talking about personality traits determine voting patterns to a great degree. So people vote their temperaments. And this is something that's really useful to understand when you're engaged in a political discussion, is that the person across the table from you who holds viewpoints other than yours is not doing it because they're stupid or ill-informed. They're doing it because they are not the same sort of person you are. And the funny thing about creative people versus conservative people, say, or liberal people versus conservative people, is that liberals start companies and conservatives run them. So, and I
you do
seriously mean that.
I'm glad to know you
each
need
other.
conservatives.
Yeah.
I was
yeah,
getting
well,
a little bit worried.
they're managers. Like conscientious people make good managers and good administrators. And they tend to do better in school too, because diligence and dutifulness is an excellent predictor of academic performance. So if you want something that's already been invented, implemented, and then turned into a machine, you don't get someone creative to do that. They're off to do the next thing. They're not even interested in that. You'll bore them to death. So.
Wow. So let's say you're an employer and you need some creative people.
Yep.
Is there a psychometric test to find out if someone's actually creative and they're going to be useful?
Well, IQ tests work. I mean, not everyone with a high IQ is creative. Lots of lawyers have high IQs and they tend not to be creative at all. Well, you think about why that is, eh? Because lawyers are bound by precedent and rules, and so that isn't the same as being creative. And you want a creative accountant? No, not really. not unless you're looking for a jail sentence. So
They don't like that word at all.
No, yeah, that's right. My creative accountant, wink, wink. Right. So I mean, I psychometrically tested the 100 most creative lawyers in Canada as a project about 15 years ago with a magazine called L'Expert, which was a high prestige magazine among lawyers. And we had lawyers from across the country be nominated by their firms for creativity. And so we got some really, these were outstanding lawyers. So, and we tested them psychometrically, very, very high in intelligence, but not creative at all. The first trait was conscientious, dutiful, hardworking, diligent, industrious, orderly. Because you're working 70 hours a week, and you better bloody well work if you're in a position like that too. So it's nose to the grindstone stuff. Very low in neuroticism because it's very stressful. So they didn't experience much negative emotion. Very disagreeable people. Well, they're litigators, eh? And so they want to win. They're not compassionate and they're not polite. And only after that were they open. So they weren't creative at all, but they were extraordinarily intelligent. So.
Do employers look for creative people?
No, not generally. Well, it's a real conundrum. So one of the things that's happening right now is that in most businesses, the non-creative people are increasingly being replaced by machines, right? Because anything that's creative can't really be turned into an algorithm that you can run as a machine, but anything that isn't creative can be. And so there's increasing demand in corporations for creative people, but the problem with being creative is that you're useless at the bottom of a dominance hierarchy. Because at the bottom of a dominance hierarchy, so a power hierarchy, you should do what you're told to do. You're not there to think outside the box. You're there to learn what you're supposed to do and implement it. And creative people are that isn't what they do. Now, what happens though to companies is that because they filter all the creative people out at the bottom, and then people start to rise up to the top, you really need creative people at the top because they are the entrepreneurial types, and they're the ones, for example, in law firms, even though lawyers aren't very creative, the more entrepreneurial ones are the ones that bring in all the business. There's like great lawyers who can implement, who can write well and communicate well. They're not a dime a dozen, but they're relatively common. But the ones who are entrepreneurial, who can go out there and drum up new business, man, those people are hyper valuable, and they're very rare. But it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system, because systems do not nurture creativity. They're the antithesis of creativity, because the artist is always the person who stands outside the structure, and so, or maybe builds his or her own structure, which is also why it's hard to evaluate creative people. You can't, really, because if they're operating within the confines of a system that has an evaluative structure, they're not creative.
We're having a conversation. I'm deciding I'm going to listen to you, right? That's different than how people generally communicate, because usually when they communicate, they're doing something like, okay, we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to tell you why I'm right, and I'll win if you agree. Or maybe you're having a conversation where, I don't know what you're trying to do. Maybe you're trying to impress the person you're talking to. So you're not listening to them at all. You're just thinking about what you're going to say next. Okay, so that's not this. This is, you might have something to tell me. And so I'm going to listen on the off chance that you'll tell me something that would really be useful for me to know. And so you could think about it as an extension of the Piagetian. Piaget talked about the fundamentally important element of knowledge being to describe how knowledge is sought, the process by which knowledge is generated. Well, if you agree with me and I find that out, I know nothing more than I knew before. I just know what I knew before. And maybe I'm happy about that because, it didn't get challenged. But I'm no smarter than I was before. But maybe you're different than me, and so while I'm listening to you, you'll tell me something I don't like. Maybe it's something I find contemptible or difficult, whatever. Maybe you'll tell me something I don't know, and then I won't be quite as stupid. And then maybe I won't run painfully into quite as many things. And that's a really useful thing to know, especially if you live with someone and you're trying to make long-term peace with them, is they're not the same as you. And their way they look at the world and the facts that they pull out of the world aren't the same as your facts. And even though you're going to be overwhelmed with the proclivity to demonstrate that you're right, it is the case that two brains are better than one. And so maybe 9 of the 10 things they tell you are dispensable, or maybe even 49 out of 50, but one thing, all you need to get out of the damn conversation is one thing you don't know. And one of the things that's very cool about a good psychotherapeutic session is that the whole conversation is like that. All you're doing is trying to express the truth of the situation as clearly as possible. That's it. And so, now, Roger's proposition, and I'll tell you why he derived it, was that if you have a conversation like that with someone, it will make both of you better. It'll make both of you psychologically healthier. So there's an implicit presupposition that the exchange of truth is curative. Well, that's a very cool idea. I mean, it's a very deep idea. I think it's the most profound idea. It's the idea upon which Western civilization, although not only Western civilization, is actually predicated. The idea that truth produces health. But for Rogers, that was the entire purpose of the Psychotherapeutic Alliance. You come to see me because you want to be better. You don't even know what that means necessarily, neither do I. We're going to figure that out together. But you come and you say, look, things are not acceptable to me, and maybe there's something I could do about that. So that's the minimal precondition to engage in therapy. Something's wrong, you're willing to talk about it truthfully, and you want it to be better. Without that, the therapeutic relationship does not get off the ground. And so then you might ask, well, what relationships are therapeutic? And the answer to that would be, if you have a real relationship, it's therapeutic. If it isn't, what you have is not a relationship. God only knows what you have. You're a slave, they're a tyrant, you're both butting heads with one another. It's a primate dominance hierarchy dispute. Oh, I don't know, you're like 2 cats in a barrel, or 2 people with their hands around each other's throats. But what you have is not a relationship. So, all right. We may say that the greater the communicated congruence of experience, awareness, and behavior on the part of one individual, that's a reference to the same idea that I was describing with regards to Jung. So let's say you come and talk to me and you want things to go well. Well, I'm going to have to more or less be one thing, because if I'm all over the place, you can't trust any continuity in what I say. There's no reason for you to believe that I'm capable of actually telling you, I'm capable of expressing anything that's true. So the truth is something that emerges as a consequence of getting yourself lined up and beating all the, what would you call, all the impurities out of your soul, for lack of a better word. You have to be integrated for that to happen, and you do that at least in part by wanting to tell the truth. The more the ensuing relationship will involve a tendency towards reciprocal communication with the same qualities. So one of the things, I've been quite influenced by Rogers, one of the things I try to do in my therapeutic sessions is first of all to listen, to really listen. And then while I listen, I watch, and while I'm listening, things will happen in my head. You know, maybe I'll get a little image of something, or I'll get a thought or a question will emerge, and then I'll just tell the person what that is. But it's sort of directionless, you know, it's not like I have a goal, except that we're trying to make things better. I'm on the side of the person, I'm on the side of the part of the person that wants things to be better, not worse. And so then those parts of us have a dialogue, and the consequence of that dialogue is that certain things take place, and then I'll just tell the person what happened. And it isn't that I'm right. That's not the point. The point is that they get to have an hour where someone actually tells them what they think. Here's the impact you're having on me. You know, this is making me angry. This is making me happy. This is really interesting. This reminds me of something that you said an hour ago that I don't quite understand. And the whole point is not for either person to make the proposition or convince the other that their position is correct, but merely to have an exchange of experience about how things are set up. And it's extraordinarily useful for people, because it's often difficult for anyone to find anyone to talk to that will actually listen. And so another thing that's really strange about this listening is that if you listen to people, they will tell you the weirdest bloody things so fast you just cannot believe it. So if you're having a conversation with someone and it's dull, it's because you're stupid. That's why. You're not listening to them properly, because they're weird. They're like wombats or albatrosses or rhinoceroses or something. Like, they're strange creatures. And so if you were actually communicating with them and they were telling you how weird they really are, it would be anything but boring. So, and you can ask questions. That's a really good way of listening. But, you know, one of Roger's points is, well, you have to be oriented properly in order to listen. And the orientation has to be, look, what I want out of this conversation is that the place we both end up is better than the place we left. That's it. That's what I'm after. And if you're not after that, you got to think, why the hell wouldn't you be after that? What could you possibly be after that would be better than that? You walk away smarter and more well-equipped for the world than you were before you had the conversation, and so does the other person. Well, maybe if you're bitter and resentful and angry and anxious and, you know, generally annoyed at the world, then that isn't what you want. You want the other person to walk away worse, and you too, because you're full of revenge. But, you know, you'll get what you want if you do that. So we know from our research that such empathic understanding, it's already defined that. I want to hear you. I want to hear what you have to say so we can clarify it and move forward. I want to have your best interests in mind, and mine as well, but, you know, both at the same time. And your families too, if we can manage that. We're after making things better. We know from our research that such empathic understanding with a person, not about him, is such an effective approach that it can bring about major changes in personality. Some of you may be feeling that you listen well to people and that you have never seen such results. The chances are very great that you have not been listening in the manner that I've described. Fortunately, I can suggest a little experiment that you can do to test the quality of your understanding. The next time you get into an argument with your wife or your friend or a small group of friends, stop the discussion for a moment and, for an experiment, institute this rule. Each person can speak up for himself only after he has first restated the ideas and feelings of the previous speaker accurately. What accurately means is they have to agree with your restatement. Now that's an annoying thing to do, because if someone is talking to you and you disagree with them, the first thing you want to do is take their argument, make the stupidest possible thing out of it that you can, that's the straw man, and then demolish it. It's like, so then you can walk away feeling good about it, and you know, you primate dominated them really nicely. So, but that isn't what you do. You say, okay, well, I'm going to take what you told me, and maybe I'm even going to make your argument stronger than the one you made. That's useful if you're dealing with someone that you have to live with, because maybe they can't bloody well express themselves very well, but they have something to say. So you make their argument strong. All right, then you see what this would mean. It would mean that before presenting your own point of view, it would be necessary for you to really achieve the other speaker's frame of reference, to understand his thoughts and feelings so well that you could summarize them for him. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But if you will try it, you'll find that it's the most difficult thing that you've ever done. Okay, good. We'll leave it at that, and then we'll see you on Tuesday. What's my advice to young men seeking a woman for marriage and family? Yeah. Well, okay, fine. That's the same second question. That's pretty straightforward, man. I mean, you can't eliminate the necessity of being attracted to one another. That's important, and that's mysterious, you know. So for example, here's a funny thing. One of the things we know that attracts people to one another is bilateral symmetry. And so if you take men and you rank them by the symmetry of their faces, and then you give the asymmetrical men t-shirts to wear, clean t-shirts for a day, and the symmetrical men clean t-shirts to wear for a day, and then you give the t-shirts to women and you have them rate the odor, the women rate the odor of the symmetrical men as more attractive than the odor of the asymmetrical men. And there are other factors that determine sexual attractiveness that are based on biological factors that are that deeply embedded in terms of smell, for example. So women also tend to not be sexually attracted to the scent of men who have, if I remember correctly, it's Rh factors that would make for potential trouble in childbirth. And often the reason that the women give for not preferring the scent of those men is that they smell too much like their brother, something like that. So there's weird, mysterious things that determine whether or not people are sexually and physically attracted to each other, and I think it's very important that that's part of a marital relationship. The next most important thing is trust, man. It's like there's no marriage that's successful without trust. You've got to tell each other the truth. And one of the reasons that Jung believed that marriage and an oath, and Carl Jung, as a bond was necessary, it's really wise. It's like, you know, telling the truth to someone is no simple thing, because there's a bunch of things about all of us that are terrible and weak and reprehensible and shameful and all of those things, and they kind of have to be brought out into the open and dealt with. And you're not going to tell the truth about yourself to someone who can run away screaming when you reveal who you are. And so the marriage bond is something like, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to handcuff myself to you, and you're going to handcuff yourself to me. And then we're going to tell each other the truth, and neither of us are going to get to run away. And so once we know the truth, then we're either going to live together in mutual torment, or we're going to try to deal with that truth and straighten ourselves out jointly. And that's going to make us more powerful and more resilient and more and deeper and wiser as we progress together through life. And I think that's absolutely brilliant, because if you leave a back door open, man, you're going to use it, that's for sure. And the oath is there, and this was Jung's commentary on the spiritualization of the human pair bond by Christian marriage, for example, which emphasized the what would you call it, the subordination of both members of the marital union to a higher order personality that was embodied in the figure of the Logos. So the idea is that in the Christian marriage, for example, the man isn't the boss and the woman isn't the boss. The boss is the mutual personality composed by the seeking of truth in both of them, and that's conceptualized as their joint subjugation to the Logos. And that is absolutely dead on, man. It's like the ruler of your marital life should be your vow to tell each other the truth. Because, like, in hard times during your life, when you've done something stupid and idiotic that might take you down, and you don't have anybody that you can turn to. You know, if you have a partner that you can trust, you can go say, hey, you know, I made a big financial mistake, man, and it's really torturing me, and I feel like a complete idiot, and it's really dangerous. And the person there is going to help you figure out what to do about it. And they're going to know that when they make a stupid mistake, and they're bloody well going to, that they can come and talk to you, and that you guys are going to work your way through it. And that's a big deal. And there's a couple of things our culture gets really wrong, and one is it devalues marriage. That's really a very bad idea, because marriage is like a third of your life, and maybe more. And kids are a third of your life, and your life outside of marriage and kids is a third of your life, you know, approximately speaking. And to miss any of that is a massive, massive mistake. Now, having said that, I will also say that for some people, missing one or more of those is necessary because they have a reason. You know, maybe they're brilliantly creative artists and they need to devote themselves entirely to their career, or they're outstanding in some way, and so they can justify the sacrifice of one part of that triad of being to another part. But generally speaking, it's a very dangerous thing, and it shouldn't be done. And also, kids get an absolutely terrible rap, you know, because kids are delightful if they're well behaved. One of the chapters in my new book is called Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And you can do that, especially if you discuss it thoroughly with your spouse, the person that's helping you discipline the kids. And children are the best company because they're really enthusiastic about everything. They love doing new things. They really love you, so they're happy that you're around. All you have to do is make sure they're not too hot and they're not too cold, and they've had something to eat and they're not too tired, and you don't expect them to stay engaged in something for longer than they can manage. Because we used to take our kids when they were little out to restaurants, for example, and they could sit there no problem and behave really nicely when they were 2 and 3, but they couldn't do it for more than about 45 minutes. You can't push your luck. But I also noticed with little kids is that they got antsy and unreasonable about 5 to 10 minutes before the adults did too. It's just the adults were too stupid to notice. The kids would notice right away. So back to marriage. Well, you look for someone that you're attracted to, that you love, and then you look for someone that you can bloody well trust. And then you tell them the truth. And that way maybe you can get through life, and you can have someone to weave the rope of your being with, and together to make your joint rope stronger, and you can have some continuity in your narrative, and you can have children, and then you can have grandchildren, and like you can have a life, man. And there's nothing. You're so fortunate if you can manage that. And so, okay, so there's that one. So what's my advice to young men seeking a woman for marriage and family? Yeah, well, and also, you know, marry someone you think would be a good mother and that has enough sense, generally speaking, to know that she wants children. Now, some women don't want children, and fair enough. And some women perhaps shouldn't have children. That's also possible. But the general rule of thumb is, especially once a woman's, you know, in her mid-20s, if she doesn't know that she wants children or won't admit it, unless she has a viciously important reason, then she's not oriented properly psychologically. She doesn't know what's important in life. Now, that might also be the case with you, and it probably is, but as a rule of thumb, that's a really good one.
How do men and women differ in the way they evaluate mates? Well, here's a study. More than 1,000 respondents, primarily female. What they looked at was how much prestige each person had in their occupation, so kind of where they were situated in the dominance hierarchy, what their income was and their education. So they're all markers, they're all pretty decent markers of socioeconomic status, or they're pretty decent markers of status. So, and then they looked at how many partners each person had, number of lifetime partners, and number of preceding year sexual partners. Lifetime occurrence of simultaneous partners, so that was someone who was in a sexual relationship with more than one person at the same time. And lifetime frequency of simultaneous partners, from 1 very seldom or never to 5 very often. Here's their assumption. The number of partners a member of sex A acquires is an index of how often this individual is chosen by the other sex. It's just a definition. It's an indication of reproductive fitness as judged by members of the opposite sex. Results. Male criteria. For women, the correlation between their fertility rates and the number of partners in the previous year was 0.94. So that's basically markers of biological youth, and also markers of biological health, like symmetry, or waist to hip ratio, which actually tends to be correlated with reproductive fitness, because women with lower waist to hip ratios are generally healthier, because especially in youth, the acquisition of abdominal fat is often an indicator of subpar physical health. The correlation between the fertility rate and the number of partners in the previous year is 0.94. That's all of it. Right? You never see a correlation of 0.94 anywhere, ever. Males choose fertility, indicators, beauty, waist to hip ratio, youthful appearance, neonatinous facial features. And neonatinous means like an infant. So one of the markers of feminine beauty is a face that has small, childlike features. Female criteria. All respondents. The correlation between socioeconomic status and frequency of simultaneous partners. For men, it's 0.5. So the higher the status of the man, the more likely he has simultaneous sexual partners. So it means he's going out with someone sexually at the same time. For men, it's 0.49. For women, it's 0. Age 30 and over, correlation between socioeconomic status and frequency of simultaneous partners. For men, it's 0.8. For women, it's 0. Age 30 to 39, the correlation between socioeconomic status for women and frequency of simultaneous partners. For men, it's 0.92. That's a very small n, though. For women, it's 0.11. Female criteria for men. It might reflect a tendency on the part of females to choose high-status partners during their own peak reproductive years. This might account especially for the strong relationship found in men between the age of 30 and 39. Women who typically prefer men 3 to 8 years older than they are would then be in their mid to late 20s, a time when fecundability and thus sensitivity to male resources is at its peak. Supporting evidence. I don't believe that, by the way. I don't think that women pick men for their socioeconomic status. I think that women pick men for their ability to climb the status hierarchy, because we forced women in an experiment that we never published to choose between those two things. Wealth versus ability. The women overwhelmingly chose ability. They just used wealth as a marker of ability. Yeah?
Why didn't you publish that?
It was an honors thesis. And often honors theses, even if they're publishable, drift into the thing I'll do next month, and then they stay there forever. So, because it's actually quite hard to turn an honors thesis into a publishable paper, and if there isn't some single person driving that forward, it's not going to happen. So that was the only reason. Okay, so Trivers. Parental investment model contends that women are more likely than men to seek a mate who possesses non-physical characteristics that maximize the survival or reproductive prospects of their offspring, and were examined in a meta-analysis of mate selection research. As predicted, women accorded more weight than men to socioeconomic status, ambitiousness, character, and intelligence, and the largest gender differences were observed for cues to resource acquisition, status, and ambitiousness. Also, as predicted, gender preferences were not found in preferences for characteristics unrelated to progeny survival, like sense of humor and general personality. Where valid comparisons could be made, the findings were generally invariant across generations, cultures, and research paradigms. I'll go to this next one. Yeah. Okay, so here's some correlations. One of them is between how much money you make and your personality. So the correlation between neuroticism and how much money you get paid is negative 0.3. The higher you are in neuroticism, the less you make, less you get paid. Why? Why do you think that is? Well, because you're not confident in your own abilities. You have low self-esteem. And if you're not confident in your own abilities and you're anxious about your performance, the probability that you're going to feel confident and calm about negotiating for more money or even asking for a raise is quite low. Extroversion and money made, virtually no correlation. Openness, no correlation. Agreeableness, negative 0.24. Now, you might not think that those correlations are very large, but if the correlation between neuroticism and money made is negative 0.3, if you translate that into an effect size, this is called a binomial effect size distribution, just the effect of neuroticism will ensure that 65% of men make more money than average and 35% of women make more money than average. Just the effect of neuroticism. And if you add neuroticism and agreeableness together, I have to do the math because I have to take the square root. It's 0.5. 0.5. I can't do that in front of a class, unfortunately. It's going to push it up to about 70-30 or higher than that. There's a little bit of a negative correlation between conscientiousness and money made. Ascendancy, how well you progress up the ranks. Yes? I don't know, because I didn't look in detail into the models they use, so I was just going to stick to the zero order correlations. So, ascendancy, negative 0.21 for neuroticism, negative 0.14 for agreeableness. The effects are larger if you total them. Let's see. Here's a good one. This is something to think about. Job satisfaction. The correlation with neuroticism is negative 0.42. That's a big one. One of the things that's very interesting about neuroticism is it's also a very good predictor of marital satisfaction. And it's interesting in that light to note that 70% of divorces are initiated by women. Now, one reason for that is that men are impossible to get along with. And the other possibility is that women are too sensitive to that, and there's no way of sorting that out. But it's nonetheless interesting to note that that's still where the gender difference lies. Neuroticism. Correlation with job satisfaction, negative 0.42. Correlation with life satisfaction, negative 0.42. Correlation with career satisfaction, negative 0.41. So one of the things you want to remember is that almost all the measures that purport to measure something like well-being or happiness or satisfaction are so contaminated with neuroticism that it's not even clear that they're measuring something different. You see, agreeableness, the correlation with career satisfaction is negative 0.2. If you get men to rate their performance, and you get their bosses to rate their performance, men rate their performance pretty much the same as the bosses rate their performance, or maybe they rate them a little bit more. But if women rate their own performance, they rate their own performance as worse than their boss's rating of their performance consistently. And the predictor of that seems to be negative emotionality. Now you might wonder if negative emotionality is something that's associated with lower levels of life satisfaction across a broad variety of measures. What possible use could it be? But then you have to wonder, well, exactly how is the physical environment different for women and for men? And one clear fact is that at an individual level, at least in relationship to dominance battles with men, women are at a disadvantage, not least because of their size.
Here's another something worth considering, and I don't know how important it is, but it might be really important. It depends on how important. This is something that Carl Jung said, so it depends on how important Jung is. Now, Freud established the field of psychoanalysis, and with it, investigation, I would say, rigorous investigation into the contents of the unconscious. Now, modern psychologists and psychiatrists like to, what would you say, denigrate Freud. But, and I think there's a reason for that. I think that Freud's fundamental insights were so profound and so valuable that they got immediately absorbed into our culture. And now they seem self-evident, and so that all that's left of Freud is his errors. You know, because we believe everything else. We believe all the profound things he discovered. We just take them for granted, and so we don't believe the things that he said that weren't quite on the money. And that's all we credit him with now. But he was certainly the first person who brought up the idea of the unconscious in a rigorous manner. And he was the first person to do a rigorous examination of dreams, because The Interpretation of Dreams is a great book. It's well worth reading. And he was the first person to note that people were, in some sense, inhabited by sub-personalities that had a certain degree of autonomy and independent life. Brilliant observation. The cognitive psychologists haven't caught up with that at all yet. Jung was profoundly affected by Freud. Jung was profoundly affected by Nietzsche and by Freud. Those were his two main intellectual influences. I don't think one more than the other. He split with Freud on the religious issue. That was what caused the disruption in their relationship. And I think it's an extremely interesting historical occurrence. It might be of profound significance. Freud believed that the fundamental myth of the human being was the Oedipal myth. And the Oedipal myth, from a broader perspective, is a failed hero story. So the Oedipal myth is the myth of a man who develops, who grows up, but then accidentally becomes too close to his mother, sleeps with her. He doesn't know who she is, and as a consequence blinds himself. And there's a warning about human development gone wrong in that story. And I think that Freud put his finger on it extraordinarily well, because human beings have a very long period of dependency. And one of the things that you do see in clinical practice is that many people's problems are associated with their inability to break free of their family. Like they're consumed by the family drama, right? They can't get beyond what happened to them in their family. They're stuck in the past. And that's equivalent, symbolically speaking, you might say, to the idea of being too close to your mother, of the boundaries being improperly specified. And that happens far more often than anyone would like to think. As I said, Freud thought it was a universal. But Jung, see, he had a different idea, and his idea was that it wasn't the failed hero story that was the universal human myth. It was the successful hero story. And that's a big difference. Like, it's seriously a big difference. Because the successful hero story is, you remember in Sleeping Beauty, you may remember this in the Disney movie, the evil queen traps the prince in a dungeon, and she's not going to let him out till he's old, right? And so there's this comical scene where she's down in the dungeon, he's all in chains, and she's laughing at him, telling him what his future is going to be like. She's quite evil. And, you know, she paints this wonderful picture of him being freed in like 80 years and hobbling out of the castle on his horse that's so old he can barely stand up, and him with gray hair. And you know, and she recites this story of his eventual triumphant departure from the castle as an old and decrepit man, and she has a great laugh about it. And it's nice, you know, it's a real punchy story. It's really something wonderful for children, that story. And he gets free of the shackles. And the things that free him are three little female fairies. So it's the positive aspect of the feminine that frees him from the dungeon. So it's very interesting and very accurate from a psychological perspective. It's the negative element of the feminine that encapsulates him in the dungeon, and it's the positive element of the feminine that frees him. And then he has the queen, the evil queen, is not very happy when he escapes. You may remember this. She stands on top of her castle tower and starts to spin off cosmic sparks. I mean, she's quite the creature, enveloped in flame, and then she turns into a dragon. And then the prince has to fight with her in order to make contact with Sleeping Beauty and awaken her from her comatose existence, as her unconscious existence. And it's a brilliant representation of a successful hero myth. He doesn't end up staying in an unholy relationship with his mother, let's say. He escapes and then conquers the worst thing that can be imagined and is ennobled by that. And that, as a consequence, he's able to wake the slumbering feminine from its coma. And that's a Jungian story. And that's the story that he juxtaposed against Freud. See, Freud thought of religious phenomena as part of an occult tide that would drown rationality. That's why Freud was so vehemently anti-religious. And Jung thought, no, it's not the case. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's something profound and central to the hero myth. And Jungian clinical work is essentially the awakening of the hero myth in the analysand, in the client or in the patient, to conceptualize yourself as that which can confront chaos and triumph, and that's associated with an ennobling of consciousness and the establishment of proper positive relationships between male and female. And you know, I'm a skeptical person. I'm a very, very skeptical person, and I've tried with every trick I have to put a lever underneath Jung's story and lift it up and disrupt it, and I can't do it. I think he was right and that Freud was wrong. I mean, I have great respect for Freud. I think he got the problem diagnosed very, very nicely, and in my clinical work I see the phenomena that Freud described emerge continually, constantly. The best, if you're interested in that, there's a documentary you should watch. I may have mentioned it before. I think it's the best documentary ever made. It's certainly the best one I've ever seen. It's called Crumb. And it's about an underground cartoonist, Robert Crumb, who was part of the hippie movement, although he hated hippies. He was part of the hippie movement in the 60s in San Francisco and started the entire underground comic culture that manifested itself eventually in graphic novels. He was quite a significant figure from the perspective of popular art, and a very, very intelligent man. And also, I would say, a hero, although a very bent and depraved and warped one. Someone very acutely aware of his own shadow. And the documentary outlines his attempts to escape from his absolutely dreadful mother, and the failure of his two brothers to do the same thing. One of whom ended up as a street beggar in San Francisco, and the other who drank furniture polish and died 6 months after the documentary was produced. It's an unbelievably shocking documentary. It's the only piece of film that I've ever seen that captures Freudian pathology. I've never seen anything, because you can't see it generally unless you're in a clinical situation, unless you know the details of someone's lives, the personal, intimate details. You cannot communicate it. But the documentarist who made the film, who's Robert Zwigoff, if I remember correctly, was a friend of the Crumbs. And so he got access in a way that no one else would have. And they were also very forthright and forthcoming about their situation in general. I would highly recommend that. It's a real punch. If you want to know how a rapist thinks, like if you actually want to know, because maybe you don't want to know. In fact, you probably don't want to know. Right, because do you really want to know that? Because to understand that means to put yourself in that position and to understand it. If you really want to know how a serial sexual predator thinks and why, if you watch Crumb and you pay attention, you'll know. And that's only a tiny bit of what the film has to offer. It's really quite remarkable. Anyways, Jung split with Freud on the issue of the Oedipal story as the fundamental myth of humankind, and on the issue of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And Jung came down heavily on the side of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And he established that in a book called Symbols of Transformation, which was written in 1914. And that's the book that produced the permanent split with Freud. And that book, I would say that book's actually been written 3 times. It was written as 4 times, written as Symbols of Transformation, which Jung extensively revised when he was old. And then it was rewritten, in a sense, by a student of Jung's called Erich Neumann, who's also someone I would really recommend. Erich Neumann, I think, is Jung's greatest student. And he wrote 2 books. He wrote one called The Origins and History of Consciousness, which is a description of the development of consciousness out of unconsciousness, using the hero myth as an interpretive skeleton. So Neumann viewed the hero myth as the dramatized story of the emergence of human consciousness out of the surrounding unconsciousness in which it was embedded. The struggle of consciousness upward towards the light, like a lotus flower struggles up through the muck and the water to lay itself on the surface of the water and bloom and reveal the Buddha, which is, of course, what the lotus flower does from a symbolic perspective. And for Neumann, The hero's story was the story of the successful development of consciousness. And The Origins of Consciousness, The Origins and History of Consciousness is a great book. Interestingly, Camille Paglia read The Origins and History of Consciousness. She's one of the few mainstream intellectuals that I've ever encountered who read that and commented on it. And she believed that it would be sufficient antidote to postmodern denigration of literature. She thought it was that powerful a work, and I believe that. I think it's a remarkable book. Carl Jung wrote the foreword to that book, and he said in the foreword that it was the book that he wished he would have written. So it's sort of like Jung, he wrote, I don't remember how many volumes, dozens of very thick, difficult volumes. It was like Neumann was able to distill those into a single volume statement. And so I would also say, if you're interested in Jung, the best book to read is The Origins and History of Consciousness. It's the best intro into the Jungian world. So Jung's very difficult to understand. It requires a real shift of perspective in order to understand what he's talking about. And Neumann wrote another book called The Great Mother, which is a little bit more specialized in some sense, but it's also extremely interesting because it fleshes out the archetype of chaos and its representation as feminine. It's a brilliant book as well, and highly worth reading, both those books. Anyways, Jung was a very strange person and a visionary, and so that's kept him outside of the academic realm almost entirely. I mean, I was constantly warned as an undergraduate and then a graduate student and then a professor against ever talking about Jung in any way whatsoever. When I went on the job market, when I was at McGill, when I had graduated from McGill, I had done my scientific research on alcoholism, and I had a fairly lengthy publication record that was pure empirical research and really neurophysiological research into the pharmacology of alcoholism. And I'd established a reasonably solid dossier of publications, but at the same time I was writing this book that became Maps of Meaning, and so I'd split my time in graduate student school between these two endeavors, one very specifically neurological and pharmacological and really biologically based, and the other very abstract, religious, symbolic, psychoanalytic, the complete opposite. But I could see that the two things overlapped really nicely, and there was a number of scientists at the time that were also drawing the same conclusions, the same relationship between the biology and the psychoanalysis. Jaak Panksepp, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which is a great classic, is one of those people who saw the relationship between the neurobiology of emotion and motivation and the psychoanalytic insights. Never became a mainstream view, but I think it's too complex. I think that bridging the gap between the biology and the symbolic is too much for people, generally speaking. You know, it was certainly virtually too much for me because I got quite ill when I was a graduate student, I think, for a variety of reasons. I also would go out and party 3 nights a week, and so that probably had something to do with it. But working on those two things simultaneously was also rather exhausting. Now, Jung was a tremendously insightful clinician, and he was a strange person, introverted visionary, high in introversion, very, 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 very high in openness, like off the charts. And also, God only knows what his IQ was. I mean, every time I read Jung, it's like reading Nietzsche. It's terrifying because, you know, he's so damn smart that he can think up answers to questions that you don't even, it's not like you don't understand the answers. It's that you never conceptualized the damn questions. It's really something to read someone like that, right, who says, well, here's a mystery, and you think, wow, I never thought of that as a mystery, and here's the solution. It's like, okay, that's something, you know. And he could read Greek, and he read a very large variety of ancient languages and was very familiar with the entire corpus of astrological thought and of alchemical thought and of classic literature and biblical stories, and I mean, educated in a way that no one is educated now. And so he's a very daunting person to encounter and terrifying, absolutely terrifying. His book, Ion, which is the second volume of it's the second volume of volume 9, which is the archetypes of the collective unconscious. That damn book is just absolutely terrifying, because Jung, he's one of these visionaries who can see way underneath the social structures and look at patterns that are developing across, in Jung's case, across thousands of years, and lays them out. And so that's really something to encounter. Ion is a terrifying book.